good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending upon where you are. It's great to have you here with us. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program tonight. A special welcome and thank you to tonight's guest, Michelle Goldberg, and to our moderator, Warren Olney. Today is the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av, Tisha B'Av in Hebrew. For the Jewish people, tonight starts what for thousands of years has been called the saddest day of the year, a day of collective mourning. Sorry about that. A day of collective mourning, which includes a full day fast commemorating the destruction of the ancient temples in Jerusalem. It was a great tragedy in its time, which completely upended Jewish life and sent the Jews into exile, which lasted 2,000 years. Many modern progressive thinkers have a slightly different take on Tisha B'Av. While they mourn the destruction of the temples, they also celebrate the resilience of our survival in the diaspora. Life is complicated, and we see that more than ever in our fight for democracy. We can consider on this Tisha B'Av 2023, aspiring to look for and nurture the sparks of hope and the seeds of resilience, which can emanate even from the darkest of places. Next week on August 2nd, we are hosting journalist, author, and scholar Mark Oppenheimer, who for years wrote the Beliefs column for the New York Times. Oppenheimer holds a PhD in religion from Yale, where he taught for many years. His most recent book focuses on the killings at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. He will be in conversation with Larry Mantle on the topic of American religion today, what's new? The following week on August 9th, we will hear from the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who will be in conversation with political sociologist and global democracy expert Larry Diamond of the Spogli Institute at Stanford on the topic, momentous events in Russia and Ukraine, what do they mean? Now for a couple of additional announcements, my colleague and friend, David Lehrer. David?
Thank you, Janice. I join and welcome everyone to America at a Crossroads on behalf of Community Advocates, Inc. Janice has mentioned the next two programs, but we have much more on tap. On August 16th, we'll have a return visit from David Gergen. David has been an advisor to 4 presidents from Nixon to Clinton. He was a regular commentator on the PBS NewsHour for decades, and he's the author of last year's Hearts Touched with Fire, How Great Leaders Are Made. The following week, on August 23rd, we'll host Professor Mary Ziegler of the University of California, Davis School of Law. She's an expert on the history, politics, and law of reproduction, healthcare, and conservatism in the United States. She's a 2023 Guggenheim Fellow and one of the world's leading historians of the U.S. abortion debate. In subsequent weeks, our topics will range from a startling analysis of what the demographics of the 2024 American electorate will look like, an assessment of the Ukraine-Russia war with former Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman, and after we will host the oft-quoted Republican political strategist, Sarah Longwell. She's a font of knowledge on the electorate and what they are thinking. It's now my pleasure to welcome one of our most frequent hosts, Warren Olney. Warren is the recipient of countless awards, but 2 deserve special mention. He was named Distinguished Journalist of the Year on 2 occasions and a Lifetime Achievement Award bestowed by his peers in broadcasting. He's a revered institution in Southern California radio and TV. Warren?
Thank you, David, so very much. And let me just take note of this important day for Israel. I was interested to hear about it, and I'm sure many in the audience are observing it as well. I'm very happy to be introducing Michelle Goldberg, most familiar, of course, as a New York Times columnist. She has been there since 2017. Before that, she wrote for Salon, The Nation, The American Prospect, The Daily Beast, and Slate Magazine. She's also appeared in The New Yorker and The Guardian and many other places as well. Her books include The Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, The Goddess Pose, that's the audacious life of Indira Devi, the woman who helped bring yoga to the West, and The Means of Reproduction, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World. Michelle Goldberg, thank you very much for coming back to America at a Crossroads.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Let me also say to all of you in the audience, don't forget that if you want to ask a question, you can submit it to David Lehrer, and he will send it to me, and I will get to your questions later on in the program. So, Michelle, our topic today is how safe is American democracy? And is it doomed? That's pretty heavy stuff. I think we kind of have to go at it from the side somehow. And one of the things that it seems to me is important to American democracy is American culture. And one of the things that I know you care about a lot is women's rights. And that brings us to Barbie. And you have written about Barbie very recently. And you coupled Barbie, not with the Oppenheimer, the other movie, but with Taylor Swift's latest tour, which is going to arrive soon in Los Angeles. And they're already talking about rejiggering the transit system in order to accommodate the crowds. You say that this is important because it represents what the response to it, to those two things together, represents an underserved market. Tell us about that underserved market.
Well, I'm glad you asked this. I would, it's much more pleasant to talk about Barbie and Taylor Swift than the perilous state of American democracy, though
We'll get to
there.
that. We'll get to that.
And so basically, I mean, these are two huge, they've kind of transcended their medium, right? More than a concert, more than a movie. These are two huge entertainment phenomenon. They are economic juggernauts. Taylor Swift's tour has, the Federal Reserve has said it's raised the GDP. It's having this profound impact on the cities where she alights because so many people are traveling to see her. They're staying there, they're staying in hotels. But what I think is so significant is that it's been really quite a while before it's been quite a while since there's been sort of any big cultural moment, as one person said. I quoted one person from a Guardian story who said they were dying for just a big monocultural moment, right? They were dying to be part of something that everyone else is a part of. And there hasn't been very much of that in American culture, which is so fragmented and siloed. But I think it is also, there's something specific about these two, both about the Barbie movie and the Taylor Swift concert, or the Taylor Swift tour. I should say, because I have an 8 and a 10-year-old, I listen to a lot of Taylor Swift. So I know her discography at this point extremely well. And, although Taylor Swift, like Barbie on the surface, is this icon of Americana, kind of blonde female perfection in many ways, she's also, throughout the evolution of her career, become increasingly feminist, kind of come to see the constraints of traditional femininity with ever more ambivalence. I think the best example of this, if anyone in the audience is curious about this, just go out and watch the video for The Man, where the refrain is, about running as fast as you can, wondering if I would get there quicker if I was a man. And then there is the Barbie movie, which similarly has this extremely slick, glossy surface, but beneath it is a defiantly feminist movie, right? I don't know if you've seen Barbie yet, or if you're going to see Barbie.
I have not seen it yet.
But the villain in this movie is quite literally patriarchy as a concept. And you have this kind of climactic moment where America Ferrera's character Gloria gives this speech about the contradictions and difficulties of being a woman in the modern world. And what I think is important about that moment is not just the speech itself, but that the speech serves to wake up all of these Barbies who've been literally brainwashed into submission by the kind of men's rights Kens, which all sounds very silly, I'm sure, but also has this kind of serious resonance at this moment of extreme anti-feminist backlash. And so it's not that I think everyone who's going to see the Barbie movie is, kind of hungering for a replay of the Women's March, but you see, that people are having this kind of ecstatic reaction both to this tour and to this movie. And there is this hunger, I think, for both stories that take the emotional lives of girls and young women seriously and speak to their fears and contradictions and longings. And then there's also just, I think, this great desire among women to come together and have these joyful and cathartic experiences, because there are increasingly few, particularly since COVID, there's just not been a great many opportunities to do that. And, just if you look through all the movies that came out last year, look at the movies that are coming out for the rest of this year, there was surprisingly few that are really geared towards women, particularly if you compare it to the number of, say, Marvel movies or superhero movies or movies that are very explicitly geared towards young men. And so what's so interesting to me is that, Hollywood, obviously, you would think that just on purely capitalist grounds would be, once the strikes are resolved, you would think that there would be this impulse to serve this underserved market, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. It looks like what the lesson that people are taking from this instead is more movies about toys.
Well, that's the way you ended the column, and it's a great line. But I have to ask, does this nevertheless have some kind of political significance?
Well, I think that the political significance is that what we've seen since Donald Trump's election and the Women's March and the backlash that followed it is that kind of women have been, obviously not all women, there's conservative women, there's women who voted for Donald Trump, but you see this increasing divergence between the political opinions and kind of political behavior of women and men, especially young women and men are very far apart. Men are not nearly as liberal as young women, and young women have been increasingly politically active. They are a big reason, as particularly since the Dobbs decision, you see this kind of huge mobilization of young women that has, for example, I was in Wisconsin covering a state Supreme Court election that has ramifications, not just for abortion, but also, to go back to the topic of our conversation, democracy, because Wisconsin State Supreme Court was one place where Republican challenges to the 2016 election result were heard. It's likely to be a place where challenges to the 2024 election, the 2020 election result, and it's likely to be a place where challenges to the 2024 election result are heard. And so flipping that court from a conservative majority to a one vote liberal majority has huge repercussions for democracy, for voting rights, and for reproductive rights. And I think it was really obvious when I was reporting there, pretty obvious, I think, to both sides, that the reason that there was this outpouring of interest and passion in, what would otherwise be a fairly obscure race, right? I mean, you don't usually see national news stories about state Supreme Court elections, but it was because Dobbs has made this so existential. And there's something similar coming up, not quite the same, but a referendum, there's referendum coming up in Ohio, and we're going to see referendums in many other places.
Let me ask you about that election in Ohio, because it's so significant. And I just want to point out, I don't know that our audience is aware of this, but I read in your biography that you started defending abortion clinics at the age of 13. So you got in this.
Wait, does it say? This might have been. I don't know if it was that young. I mean, I don't know if that was on Wikipedia, but it was when I was in high school. It was a Wikipedia
claim. That's right.
Okay, well, it was when I was in high school for sure. I mean, because I grew up in Buffalo, where the I don't know if you remember the Spring of Life. This anti-abortion movement that first came, and it was like kind of direct action. So first they shut down the clinics in Wichita, Kansas. And then our mayor at the time was a very conservative Democrat, and he invited them to come to Buffalo and shut down the abortion clinics in Buffalo. And so all kinds of activists, it was my first experience of activism, was going to the clinics, before homeroom, and everyone would link arms and physically keep the clinics open, and they would sometimes kind of throw themselves at us. And this was kind of like a very serious kind of Red Rover. I don't know if you remember that game when you were a kid, but
Sure.
It sort of tried to break through the lines. And what I didn't realize then was that was probably never again going to have a political experience where, like, at the end of the day, you feel like, oh, we won. Like that quick, because the clinic stayed open. Usually politics is not that satisfying, but that was kind of a good and a powerful entry point.
Oh, okay, well, I didn't mean to distort your biography
Oh,
anyway.
sorry.
And thank you for explaining it more fully. But the situation in Ohio is this, for people who aren't aware of it. that in November, there's supposed to be an election to make abortion legal in Ohio. I beg your pardon. And that's a constitutional amendment, which requires a 51% vote. But the state legislature has put another election on the ballot for August 8th, coming right up, which would change the way in which constitutional amendments have to be approved and require a 60% vote. Pardon me. The purpose of this is very clear, to prevent the abortion law from passing. So is this a threat to
Well,
democracy?
yeah, and I think that, well, something that we saw in 2022 in the midterms was that two of the things that motivated voters to come out were both threats to democracy and abortion rights. And this is a place where those two things really intersect. And it's not just Ohio, because what we've seen since Dobbs is that there's wherever there's been a ballot initiative, a straight up or down vote on whether or not abortion should be illegal, there's overwhelming support for keeping abortion legal. We saw even in Kansas, where, very, very conservative state, nonetheless, people don't want abortion to be illegal. And the reason in many states, not all states, but many states, the reason that abortion has been banned nonetheless, in spite of the will of the electorate, is because you have these extremely gerrymandered state houses that, that are sort of not responsive to democracy. You have state houses in Wisconsin where you can have a pretty substantial Democratic majority of the, even if a pretty substantial majority of citizens vote Democratic, you will nevertheless end up with a Republican majority. So in Ohio, I think it's since the progressive age, they've had this ballot initiative process that has been there with the express purpose of being able to kind of circumvent plutocratic power and circumvent the power of big money on legislatures. And so in order to head off this kind of popular revolt against an abortion ban, you have something that's interesting is that just not very long ago, to be honest, I'm not sure exactly the mechanism of this, but not very long ago, Ohio actually banned August special elections because it's such a strange time to have an election. It's very low turnout. And so they banned it, but then they kind of unbanned it for this, so I think the hope was that it would kind of go under the radar. It would be something that only activists or people who are very, very plugged in would be aware of, so part of the challenge for the no vote, the no side is the side that wants to vote against raising the threshold for a ballot initiative to 60%, has just been, it's not really to convince people, it's just to get the word out, to explain that there's this weird election on August 8th, and B, that this somewhat kind of convoluted language that doesn't seem to have anything to do with abortion is actually all about abortion. And, this is not just in Ohio, this is happening. There's an effort to change the ballot initiative process in Missouri and other places.
Let me ask you about another column that you recently wrote at length about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Because I think he's interesting, and what you pointed out about him is interesting in terms of what it says about the nature of the polarization that is occurring in this country. And I just want to read a statement by Kennedy, which he made on the Hannity program. And here's what he said. "We have a system of cushy socialism for the super rich and a brutal, savage, merciless capitalism for the poor. And it's all designed to strip mine the middle class in this country of all their equity, all of their assets, and move it to the upper echelons." Now that went over on Hannity. That doesn't seem like the right place for that. What is it about Kennedy that he seems to be getting attention there and a lot of publicity, as well as on the side of more, in this case, you would think, somewhat radical Democrats?
Well, I don't know how much actual kind of radical Democratic support he has, but so I do think that.
No, but those are the kinds of appeals that are,
yes,
and arguments that are made by people on the left. I'm not suggesting he does have support, just that
Right.
those are the kinds of arguments he made. Here he is making them on Hannity.
So I would say there's a couple of different pieces. I mean, part of it is just about the kind of on the right, increasingly, you see culture war issues are much more salient than economic issues. So there's more space for, sort of critiques of inequality. There's not that much appetite to actually do anything about them, mind you, but at least there is this openness to populist language, and Donald Trump drew on some of that as well. So it's, to me, it's not that strange that Hannity would kind of let a statement like that fly. And, of course, I think that's true. And when you listen to Robert F. Kennedy, part of the, kind of power is that he mixes things that are obviously true with things that are either highly, tendentious or else just outright false. But disentangling it, particularly in real time, is extremely difficult, and you kind of can see why these audiences, and he does have this adoring fan base, why to them it feels so deeply resonant. I went to go see him in New Hampshire. Yes, was it in May? Maybe now I can't even remember if it was May or June. But I went to go see him because he obviously has a huge online fan base, right? He's very popular on Twitter. He's popular with lots of tech bros. He's been endorsed by Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter. He's been endorsed by various other Silicon Valley figures.
I think Elon Musk has had good things to say about him too.
Right. He appears on a lot of podcasts. It was not clear to me how much that translated into an organic following in the real world. So I get to New Hampshire and I drove there from New York. Because my last trip to New Hampshire had been kind of a mess. It's hard. And so I drove there to New York, took about 5 hours, and got there a little bit later than I had got to the speech, a little bit later than I planned to. Excuse me, maybe a half hour before we went on. And immediately realized I was going to have to park really far away, right? Like I'm just driving past lots and lots and lots and lots, and they're all full. And I park and I get up there, and there's just so many people in line. There's so many people there. It was, I think, a 580 seat auditorium, and it became very obvious that most of these people were not getting in. And some people would go and watch the speech from overflow rooms. So there is absolutely a, kind of real world component of these things. The people I met some people who had voted for Joe Biden in 2020. Nobody who was sort of planning on voting for him in 2024. So these weren't people who, at first I thought maybe and I do think that some of his support in the polling, when you've seen some of those polls where he's getting like 20%, some of that, my guess, is just people who think Joe Biden is too old, and they see that there's a Kennedy on the ballot and they say, okay, yeah, I'll vote for him. I don't think that's most of the people who are actually going to see him and going to support him. These are the people who are going to see him are either people who are sort of right-leaning or who are just so disenchanted, excuse me, with the Democratic Party, who are very open to Kennedy's message on Ukraine. He kind of blames a lot of the war between Ukraine and Russia on Ukraine and wants to see American pressure on Ukraine to make a lot of concessions to Russia. And a lot of the people that I met, they didn't vote at all in 2020. There's so many people who are so suspicious, so disconnected from the political system. And kind of that's what he's speaking to. He's speaking to people who, I think I wrote in my piece, it's this weird combination of intense cynicism and intense credulity. Because on the one hand, they kind of don't believe anything experts say, but on the other hand, they're open to all sorts of wild theories.
And you talked about how this idea of the cynicism and the lack of credibility of government started with the assassination of John Kennedy. And then was added to, of course, by the assassination of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and all of that. And that somehow Kennedy and the people who are supporting him lump those things together, even people who have some claim to intellectual understanding and so on, including one of the guys you worked for at one point.
Yeah, my old boss, David Talbot. I mean, although
Yeah.
my old boss, David Talbot, who was the founder of Salon, who I worked for many years ago, he has long believed that the CIA and kind of various shady government forces were behind the assassination of JFK, of RFK, of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And further, I think he believes that, excuse me for this cough. Further, I think he believes that that it's this kind of festering wound in the body politic. And this is something I heard from other people around Kennedy as well, that there's this wound that until we kind of air it out, until we have some sort of reckoning, we're never going to heal. They draw a straight line, basically say, kind of JFK was murdered. And that was the moment that everything in the United States started to go wrong. So there's this intense element of nostalgia for, kind of Camelot era United States. And they will conflate that with, the kind of economic situation of the United States in 1963. But there's an idea, almost this kind of spiritual idea, that by coming to terms with what they believe was this great evil that kind of robbed the country of the America of John F. Kennedy, that if we can somehow reckon with that, expose it, we can kind of get back to that old sort of America. There was another, I found this so interesting. There's a kind of one of the people who's running communications for RFK is this new age writer named Charles Eisenstadt, who has said, he basically says that with the murder, what he says, the assassination of JFK, the United States kind of had been on this timeline of greater and greater progress, greater and greater equality, optimism, and that the assassination of JFK knocked us off it, but that we can kind of return to that timeline somehow. So there's a lot of kind of magical thinking in this.
But in the meantime, there's a conspiracy theory that was sort of a deep state behind all of this, which it seems to me,
oh yeah, absolutely,
and that comports, and you pointed out in your piece, with the suspicions we now see raised by Donald Trump and others about the Justice Department, about the FBI, about the Internal Revenue Service and the other agencies of government. And there's this destruction of institutions that have kept us going over time. And I'm wondering, as you get into all of this, again, the extent to which there's a threat to democracy in this way of thinking. And Kennedy might win in New Hampshire because it's possible that Biden won't be on the ballot for various complicated reasons that have to do with the way the parties are organized. And there might be more. We might have to deal with this on an ongoing basis. Let's put it that way.
Right. So in terms of just Kennedy winning in New Hampshire, as I'm sure most of the audience knows, the DNC decided to change the primary calendar so that South Carolina would go first, but this hasn't gone over well in New Hampshire. And so there's some question of whether New Hampshire is going to have their primary before South Carolina anyway. And if that happens, then Biden most likely won't be on the ballot, which would make it far more possible that somebody like Kennedy could win. And it's kind of, there's nothing nefarious about that, but I think that for a lot of sort of people who have latched on to Kennedy, it can be easily spun if he, wins New Hampshire and then tanks, that there's something sinister afoot. Yeah. And so, yes, I think that there's the title of a book. It's probably come up on this, it's probably come up with other speakers. It's a book about contemporary Russia called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And that's a title I think about all the time with relation to the right and not just the right, kind of all of the forces that are kind of undermining truth, not just in institutions, right, but in any sort of consensus reality. And there's people who for a long time were on the left who, people like Naomi Wolf, who now have become also very much a part of this project, who've kind of given themselves over to this self-enclosed kind of shadow world where basically everything that we believe to be true is just, is just the kind of, it's just deep state brainwashing. And it's very difficult to, so in an environment like that, you can make all sorts of wild charges. I mean, it's the reason why it's for some of the wild charges that the Republicans are likely to bring if they impeach Joe Biden. When you just kind of slip any bounds of empiricism or objective reality, it's very difficult to hold anybody accountable.
Well, back to this question of challenging institutions, which is coming so much from the right. How is it different? How is it similar, do you think, from what's going on now in Israel?
What you mean, having a kind of destructive strongman who's willing to burn down the institutions to avoid going to prison?
A movement to
right. No, but I just mean, there's
the justice system, the FBI,
absolutely. I mean, I think
the judicial system.
Right. I mean, it's what's going on in Israel, but not just Israel. It's what's going on, the kind of prototype for this in many ways was Hungary and Viktor Orban's illiberal democracy, which keeps, some of the superstructure of democracy. They continue to have elections. They might dispossess their political rivals, but their political rivals are walking around, and yet it's in no sense a liberal democracy, because basically once the kind of ruling right-wing party has power, they set about dismantling any sort of checks on their authority. And so you're seeing that, I think, pretty clearly in Israel right now. There is, and as you know, and as our viewers know, this intense amount of despair and rage in the wake of this this latest law to cut back on the reasonableness doctrine. Israel doesn't have a written constitution, so you have the Supreme Court the Supreme Court has historically applied this standard of whether kind of laws or government actions are quote unquote reasonable. Now we're in this kind of extraordinary situation where the Supreme Court is going to consider whether a restriction on the reasonableness doctrine is reasonable. And, kind of either way, you're going to have a large part of the country that feels completely dispossessed. And I mean, what I think it shows is that for such a long time, both Israel and the United States has acted as if the settlement enterprise could be kind of separated from the rest of Israel and the rest of Israeli politics. I've always been struck in Israel by the degree to which, I mean, a part of this is just despair about the prospects for peace and the prospects for a two-state solution. So a lot of people just don't want to think about the occupation. They, it kind of has almost been outside of politics. And, similarly in the United States, I mean, Thomas Friedman, who's, no left-wing anti-Zionist, has written about how our foreign policy has been conducted as if the settlements were a temporary aberration, as if there was some kind of post-settlement reality that we're moving towards, which has not been the case for some time. But what you've seen is that the anti-democratic spirit that has festered in the settlements, where people don't feel bound by the laws of the state proper in many cases, that's now taken over the country's the country as a whole, and many of the people who have been pushing these kind of quote unquote reforms are people who come out of the most militant of the settlements, and now they're in charge of the whole country.
Let me ask you about your column, which I'm sure that a lot of listeners are aware of, where you talked about Jamila Jayapal, the leader of the the Democratic leftist group, who said at one point that what was happening was that Israel was becoming, or was already, a racist state. She immediately told you, apparently directly, after having said that she was sorry she said it. She didn't mean to say it that way. And you have said that what she should have said was a state that has racist leaders who treat many of the people under their authority as second-class citizens on account of their ethnic and religious background. Can you elaborate a little bit about all that? Because people feel passionate about it. It has a lot to do with the way that Americans feel about Israel, a country to which we give an enormous amount of money every year.
So I mean, look, I think that the furious reaction to what she said, even if she misspoke, the kind of ferocity of the condemnations speak to the fact that Israel still is a third rail in American politics, and there's a huge taboo against speaking, I think, in many cases, forthrightly. I mean, you have a government right now where I think there's two separate questions. So part of the reason why people were so upset that she used the phrase racist state is because it calls back to the anti-Zionist slogan, Zionism equals racism. And so I think a lot of people heard what she said as if she were condemning the foundation of Zionism and saying that Zionism was inherently racist. And she wasn't. That's never been her position. I mean, this is somebody who voted for Iron Dome funding, but so she was quick to clarify that that's not what she meant. But the idea that it should somehow be beyond the pale to describe Israel as it exists today as a racist state, when you have Netanyahu, as you know, has said that Israel is not a state for all its citizens. It's the state for the Jewish people. This was a change in the basic law, I believe, in 2018. That was, very shocking to many secular and left-leaning Israelis, not to mention Palestinians living in Israel. And so you have both, I mean, the sort of obvious, you have in Israel, the full state of Israel, or is it the full territory controlled by Israel today? You have basically roughly equal numbers of Jews and Palestinians. Most of those Palestinians, there's no pretense to equal rights, right? Their lands are confiscated, their movement is curtailed, they can be detained on, they don't have anything approaching the kind of civil rights that prevail in Israel proper. And without a doubt, there's a lot of this is to do with both the corruption of the Palestinian Authority and the kind of theocratic dictatorship in Gaza. But I think, and I would really urge anyone who is curious about this or who really doubts what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not going to convince you, but I would really encourage people to go visit the West Bank, go visit Hebron, go see the kind of go see the two-tier system that exists. The roads where Jews can go, but Palestinians can't go. Roads that in some cases are right outside the Palestinians' front door. Go see it for yourself. It's really easy, I think, for particularly American Jews who have this romantic conception of labor Zionism to imagine that even if Israel does these things that seem brutal to us in the West, it must be because they're so besieged, and they have been besieged, and that, and to kind of always give them the benefit of the doubt. But the settlements are not about Israel's security, and the settlement project is increasingly the project of the Israeli state. And so you have this kind of, no pretense to equal rights for the Palestinians who are under, it seems like, permanent Israeli rule. And then for Palestinian citizens of Israel, you have, I think it's more subtle, but there is still a great deal of discrimination. A Palestinian Israeli citizen friend of mine was telling me about going back recently to visit family in the West Bank with his wife is Palestinian from the West Bank. He is an Israeli citizen. Both are also American citizens. but they couldn't enter the country at the same point. They had to kind of endure all sorts of degrading, restrictions on their movements and checkpoints and permissions just to be able to reunite as a married couple. And I mean, those are people with the privilege of American citizenship. If you are, for example, a Palestinian in Israel who marries someone in the West Bank, you can never be reunited. You can never have your spouse naturalized. And so, you know, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but just at a certain point, I think American liberal Jews have to admit that it's kind of a fantasy to see all of this as temporary, as opposed to the kind of the direction that Israel has chosen to go in.
Okay, let me interrupt you if I may, because I really want to get to the questions of the audience, and some of them have to do with Israel, but others don't. And we were back on the question of American democracy. So let me hit a couple of those. First, Amina wants to know how damaging will Cornel West be to the Democrats' chances next year?
I'm really scared of that. I mean, I'm much more scared of Cornel West than I am of RFK, because, you know, the margins are so small. I'm old enough to have lived through Ralph Nader. And so even though on the one hand, you would have thought that both the experience of the 2020 election and then the experience of Donald Trump would have kind of taught progressives a lesson about the danger and futility of these kind of protest votes. I mean, again, given if you look at the kind of tiny margins that Trump won by in just a few states in 2016, I would be very surprised if Cornel West's share of the vote isn't bigger than that. And so, yeah, I think the danger is real.
We're all reminded of Ralph Nader in the year 2000. Janice wants to ask, how dangerous is the Alabama decision to ignore the Supreme Court's ruling on reapportionment?
I mean, I think that it's just, I mean, it almost seems like massive resistance, right? Like, this is kind of, you know, we've seen this movie before where Supreme Court, in this case, hardly a liberal activist Supreme Court, says that, you know, a court that has been very willing to gut the Voting Rights Act, that is hardly, you know, kind of out there to, you know, is hardly kind of interested in overriding state maps in many cases, has said that what Alabama has done is so egregious that it violates the law. And when you have Alabama basically say, I think that at this, you know, when this happened in the 1960s, you could have JFK, you know, send the National Guard down to kind of enforce the will of the federal government. That is obviously, or I think obviously, maybe it's not obvious to everyone, it seems obvious to me that that is no longer, that in a country as heavily armed as ours, in a country as febrile as ours, that is not a possibility. And so, you know, we have this kind of fragmenting of authority along all different kinds of lines. We're also going to see, I think, increasingly cases where states are at odds and it's not clear what the governing authority should be between them. And so, yeah, there is this kind of terrifying sense of entropy.
Timothy wants to know a similar question, but one about Cornel West, who's running as a third-party candidate. How serious do you think is the no labels group? Are they going to hurt Biden?
Yes, they are. I mean, unless they decide, we'll see how far they actually go. I believe Joseph Lieberman has said that they will pull back if they're going to be a spoiler candidate. But I mean, part of the difficulty is that this is an extremely, I mean, I think that a third party movement in this country is doomed, but this is an extremely tempting environment for a third party candidate because there is so much dissatisfaction. You know, so few people are actually eager to see a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. There is this hunger for an alternative, and so there's going to be this immense temptation for this group that exists to kind of transcend the excuse me, to transcend the two parties, right? There's this huge temptation for them, even though, I mean, no labels actually represents in some ways the narrowest part of the electorate. I mean, you can look this up online. You can see when the American electorate ideologically is kind of put on a scatter graph, you know, with four tiles. There's on a scale from both socially conservative to socially liberal and economically conservative to economically liberal. The part of that graph represented by no labels, the kind of socially liberal, economically conservative, is actually the least populated, right? There are a ton of people like that in the kind of Acela corridor, but there are far more people who are economically liberal and socially conservative. That's the real kind of underserved demographic in American politics. So I think no labels has this fantasy that they represent some sort of common sense middle. They really don't. But as long, you know, I think that, yes, if they decide to actually field a candidate, it's going to be, there's a very good chance that they could throw the election to Donald Trump.
We talked about the Dobbs decision, or the effect of the Dobbs decision in some state cases. You mentioned Wisconsin. We talked about Ohio. Maureen wants to know, what about the chances for the Democrats in 2024? What impact is the Dobbs decision going to have on them?
I think we've already seen, you know, we've seen in 2022, we've seen in some of these special elections that the Dobbs decision continues to mobilize and infuriate, I mean, not just women, but primarily women. And so there's some hope among conservatives that this is going to blow over, but I just don't see how it does blow over, because it is something so intimate. And it's something that, you know, I think women and their families are learning in many of these red states, that even if you don't think of yourself as the sort of person who would ever have an elective abortion, this is going to affect your decisions about your family because of what it means if you have a pregnancy, a wanted pregnancy that goes wrong. You know, there's just the way that this law has been, not the way that this law, the way that the state laws post Dobbs have been implemented. I think I've been really shocked by their cruelty, by the fact, I mean, in some ways this was predictable. You can see this in any country. I've reported from a lot of countries where abortions are illegal, and it's always been, you know, it's always been brutal. But I've been a little bit surprised that there hasn't been more effort to kind of soften the blow, that there hasn't been more effort to, if not carve out exceptions, because these exceptions never really work in practice, not to kind of make clear to hospitals that when you have someone with a doomed pregnancy who's hemorrhaging, that you're allowed to act. But there's, you know, you have basically the Republican Party, which in many cases is a minority faction, and that party is in the grips of its own minority faction, the kind of hardest core of the anti-abortion movement, that won't allow for any moderation, any softening. And so I just can't see this becoming less salient between now and 2024.
Okay, once again, our theme was how safe is American democracy. We strayed away from it for a while, but Philip wants to know, what should people be concerned, or what concerned people should be doing, let me put it that way, how to preempt the anti-democratic forces that are determined to undermine our democratic processes, and they're certainly around. We've talked about some of them.
I mean, I think the most important thing, this is kind of, maybe it sounds very banal, but I think the most important thing people can do is get involved at the local level, because we saw in 2020 all over the place, you know, Arizona, Michigan, you saw these local officials, Democratic officials, Republican officials, kind of nonpartisan officials, who took their jobs very seriously and did the right thing in the face of enormous amounts of pressure. But in many cases, that pressure has become just insupportable, and people have been driven out of their jobs, or they have, you know, kind of lost local elections that people weren't paying that much attention to for some of these election jobs around election administration. I think the most important thing that you can do is you pay attention to who's in these roles. You know, maybe run for some of these offices yourself or find out where there are people of integrity who are running for these offices and support them. But something that the right has done more skillfully historically than the left is to kind of build their politics from the bottom up. You know, the left is focused rightly on presidential elections. Presidential elections are really important. We've been focused on presidential elections because that determines who controls the Supreme Court. The right has also been focused on that. But my first book was called Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism. And that book came out in 2006. So that was, I didn't know how far Christian nationalism was going to rise. But one thing I wrote about when I wrote about that book was just, you saw then, and I think you're seeing it again, the focus on things like school boards, town councils. These were both a way to transform the culture of various places, but they were also these phenomenal training grounds for these conservative activists who then moved up through the ranks.
Let's talk about the national elections for a moment. Marcia says that the economic news of late has been excellent. The U.S. is the best economy in the world. She wants to know why the public isn't feeling that. Let me add, what about the fact that so many people are unhappy with Joe Biden for whatever reason? That's really a separate question, but it seems to me they go together.
Yeah, no, I think they do go together. And I mean, I think we'll see, right? Because some of the economic improvements they might just take a little while to sink in with people. And so there could be some of that. But also, I think that when you ask people about the economy, they're not necessarily, they're concerned about, people are concerned about inflation, don't get me wrong, they're concerned about wages, they're concerned about their economic well-being. Although if people are typically more sanguine about their own economic well-being than about the economy as a whole. And so I think in some cases, the economy just becomes another way of talking about like the state of the country, and there's an element of this that is just kind of vibes, right? Like things feel really unstable and frightening. The climate emergency is increasingly undeniable. The scars of the pandemic have, traumatized people and also traumatized cities. Cities are still struggling terribly. I live in New York City. I certainly don't think it is the hellhole that the right makes it out to be. I never hesitate to get on the subway. But nevertheless, things are not as they were 4 years ago. And so there's this just sense of like things are going wrong, things are out of control. And Joe Biden is the president and he's said he would make things normal again, but things aren't normal. And so it's not surprising to me that people are, sort of not happy with the way things are. And then the other piece of this, of course, is that some of this COVID aid or some of the things that, for example, we saw this huge reduction in child poverty due to these pandemic measures, but those are being rewound. And so some of the I think that many of the changes that Joe Biden has made will be long lasting, but for some people, there's a kind of impending loss.
So is this going to hurt Joe Biden in the sense that people are likely to stay home who might otherwise vote for Biden, whereas the Republicans will be more motivated?
I don't know. I think that we've seen since Donald Trump, came into our lives, we've seen really, really high turnout elections. I think there's some danger, particularly if the student loan relief is wound back. I think you might see some number of young people feeling disenchanted and, what has Joe Biden done for us? You certainly hear about that in focus groups and the like. Yeah. At the same time, I think, Donald Trump, who's likely to be the nominee while he is under federal indictment and or awaiting sentencing, federal sentencing or state sentencing, he's a pretty good impetus to go out to get out and vote. So, I think people are going to be highly engaged, even if they're also really grumpy about it.
Let me give you an opportunity, if you will, to take a moment to talk about things that you might see that cause you to feel positively about what's happening, rather than feeling that American democracy is not safe?
And it goes back to what we started with, right? Which is that you've seen, I remember feeling I was in such a dark place when Donald Trump was elected. I mean, I was really just, it was bleak for everyone, but I just remember feeling like so hopeless. And then, I don't know if you remember this, there was this election in the Georgia 6th district. There was a special election to fill the seat of this guy named Tom Price, who Trump had appointed. And it had been a historically Republican seat held by Newt Gingrich, and John Ossoff, who's now a senator, ran for this seat. And I remember going down there, and he lost that election, but I remember going down there and meeting so many women who had not been that political before, people who usually voted, but didn't, politics was definitely not at the center of their lives. And they had been transformed by Donald Trump's election. They were suddenly obsessed with electing local Democrats. They were obsessed with doing anything they could to both, kind of salvage women's rights, salvage democracy. I don't think that those two things can necessarily be disentangled. And that involvement that I saw then, that led to Democratic victory in 2022, that's led to Democratic victory in all of these referendums. That's still there. I mean, that's still there. That was there in Wisconsin, where it was a few months ago for this judicial election. I think that will be, that we'll see, but I think there's some intimations that that's there in Ohio. And so, the central problem in American politics, I think, is minority rule. And, the kind of ability of the majority to make decisions about self-government is very much under threat. But at the same time, I think the majority, we've seen again and again, will mobilize to defend their rights.
Well, we'll assume that in some sense, at least, we can say that America is safe in democracy, at least for the moment.
For the moment.
Well, it's been wonderful to have you, Michelle, very much, and thank you so much for
thank you.
Returning. And I know that we'll want you back on America at a Crossroads. Great to have you, and
thank you.
Look forward to seeing you, reading your columns, and seeing you so often in so many other places. Thanks again for being with us.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Next week, the religion scholar Mark Oppenheimer is going to be with us. He's the former author of the New York Times Beliefs column, and he's going to talk about American religion, what's new. He will be questioned by Larry Mandel, my friend from LA IST, and that's going to be Wednesday, August 2nd at 5 o'clock, of course, Pacific Standard Time. So thanks to you all for watching today. Be sure to come back again, and in the meantime, be healthy, stay safe. Thanks again.